Thank you. Before we begin, I want to say thank you to a few people. First of all, particularly thank you to Sam Jack and the Newton Public Library for arranging this and inviting us here. Thank you very much to the board of Warkentin House for making this possible. We also thank our publishers, Gretchen Ike, Michael Pogue, and Michael is there he is, who are responsible for getting this into print, and we're delighted with that. They are out of Wichita, a company called Blue Cedar Press, and they will in fact have books for sale after our talk. Feel free to buy 4 or 5. They make excellent gifts. Anyway, there we go.
I'm going to introduce him, and he's going to introduce me. We feel that after 40 or so years together, we probably know what to say. So I'm going to check. Warren, as Sam said, is an architect. He is a professor of design, and he is an architectural historian. He is also a carpenter and cabinet maker, and in fact, we got to know each other when I went to work for him as a cabinet maker's assistant a long time ago.
Could you speak just a little bit louder?
Yeah. He took a gap year in college, also a long time ago, and spent part of it helping to build a house, a frame house in Connecticut, and that was the beginning of his rapture with framing and American wood frame domestic architecture. My experience of that is principally wherever we are in a car or on foot, if he sees a house that is different or unusual or has anything that grabs his eye, no matter how fast we're going in the car, he slams on the brakes, pulls over, yells, "Holy smokes," backs up, jumps out of the car, and has to take a picture. And so our 2 boys and I got very used to this over the years, and he has amassed an amazing trove of photographs of houses all over, not just America, but also parts of Europe. So that is life with Warren.
Let's talk about you. Susan Kander is a classical music composer. She writes operas, both the libretto and the music. She works nowadays with a collaborator who lives in Kansas City, a woman named Roberta Dumble. Together they had one of their operas called DWB, Driving While Black, produced in New York City 2 years ago. It was also produced in Washington, D.C., and it's going to be in Birmingham, Alabama in about 6 and 9 months, 12 months maybe. Anyway, she's also working on a brand new opera with the same collaborator that will be getting a workshop at Kansas, let me get this right, Kansas University.
In Lawrence.
In Lawrence, because there's more than one, I think.
Yeah.
Kansas University in Lawrence next January, and she is also, Susan has been a playwright for much early part of her writing career. We live in Manhattan, not the one in Kansas, and have been married for 39 years. We have 2 children. One is a novelist, the other is a conductor and a violinist.
So, I am write it together. It is completely a product of his own brain. It came to him pretty full blown, a little bit like Aphrodite out of the head of Zeus. And essentially, the backbone and the characters and the narrative and the chapters are all functions of his imagination.
One night I was at dinner in a friend's house in upstate New York, and it was New Year's Eve, and the hostess was telling a story about the renovation of the house, and a story she had told before, and she turns to the portrait on the wall on the sideboard above her and says to the portrait, "Oh, but you know all this already, don't you?" That was where the book began. 5 days later, I started writing it, and I knew the book was going to be about a portrait hanging on the wall and about a house. And the house that was closest and dearest to my heart is these Ambleside, which is here at number 1 Ambleside Lane, on the other side of those railroad tracks. I belong to a writers group, and I have been working on a few chapters of the book early on, and the writers group kind of said very nice things about the idea for the book, but they said, well, your two characters' voices sound rather similar in the politest way possible. And so I live with the playwright and a person who's also a librettist and a musician who has an ear for voices. And so I asked her over dinner,
I think you're on bended knee.
if she would join me in writing this book. So that is precisely what happened. And we started together I started the book in January of 2020. She jumped in late February. And
Suddenly in March, we were together all the time because of the pandemic. In fact, my opera, DWB Driving While Black, was to open in New York on March 19th.
Wow.
That didn't happen. So we have a little house in the country, and we went there thinking it would be for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so we stayed for 9 months and wrote a book.
I think we're just going to jump right in. We're going to intersperse. We're going to read from 4 different chapters, and I think we'll intersperse chapters. And as we go along, feel free to ask questions that come to your mind. If anyone has the book with them and they want to read along, we'll let you know what page we are on. We're going to start on page 12. But first, the setup for the book. Susan, can you give us the setup for the book?
Yes, I'm just missing.
Page 12?
Yes, but
Or maybe page 30. Well, you're starting on page 12.
oh yes, I got
There
it.
we go.
12.
I hope you have the same book I do.
Yes, gosh, I really do. Okay, we are in Newton, and it is 1879, and a brand new, very handsome Italianate style house has been built, and it is called Ambleside by the people who built it. The people who built it are Emmeline and Henry Luke Hart, who happen to be Warren's actual great-grandparents. A family portrait has arrived from back east because Emmeline wrote to her family and said, "Send art, there's nothing here." So the portrait has arrived, and it's been up on the dining room wall for a little while.
Finally, one evening, about 6 months after she had been hung up on the dining room wall, we became distinctly aware of a voice that could only be described as exasperated, practically a bellow.
Oh, for pity's sake, you ignorant people! It's not Peale, it's Peale, Mrs. S. Peale, and we are in no way related.
You speak? We inquired, quite surprised.
Who said that?
She snapped. We did. We are Ambleside.
What do you mean? We are Ambleside.
We are Ambleside. We are the house.
And you speak?
She asked in an astonished tone. only to other works of art made with affection and skill. Are you a work of art?
Oh my heavens, yes! Yes, I am a portrait, and I thought I would be all alone on this wall forever with these people who are not my people.
A pause ensued.
Can you see me?
She asked us. We only see that which is without. We see nothing within. Can you see within?
Yes, I see quite clearly almost the whole dining room. Can you hear them at the table? Oh, how they do talk!
We hear, but we cannot understand the language of men. Their sounds are too temporal. We only hear that which is little affected by time, that which is timeless.
Then you do not hear what these impossible people call me.
No. What are you called?
Mrs. Simon Peale is my correct appellation, but they think I am Mrs. Spiel. Some old biddy with a shaky hand wrote my name in a letter accompanying me, and it was so illegible that Mrs. S. Peale, that is myself, was read as Mrs. Spiel.
That must be most vexing.
Yes, it most certainly is. Galling, and will never be corrected.
We waited for a moment, then we asked, pray tell us, do you hear them everywhere in Ambleside?
No. Just here in the dining room, and sometimes the kitchen, unless voices are raised elsewhere, which is blessedly rare. They are, by and large, a well-tempered pair. I will give them that.
Tell us, do they speak well of us?
Oh, indeed. They praise this house to all who will listen, and over they tell the story of your very beginnings, as if you were one of the wonders of the world.
Wonders of the world? Well, we should very much like to know of such things.
Well,
She said,
there's no time like the present.
and she let out a high-pitched blast.
I died in 1841, but there's no time like the present.
We were silent. Presently the sound subsided.
Yes, yes. I can tell you the story. I have certainly heard it often enough.
Please, madam, do. Then Mrs. Peale began to unfold the mysteries of our origins.
Okay. So, how do two people write one book of fiction? That's me.
Sure.
Okay. What was our process? Well, the process was as followed. Warren would go out in the backyard with his pen and his notebook, and he would write a chapter longhand. And then he would go inside to his computer, and he would type it in and lightly edit, and then he would push send, and he would send it to me as a Word document. And I would receive it, and then the best analogy we have is that I would receive it in black and white, and then I would put color in. However, there was one important thing that had to happen sort of in the beginning. He had already written a bunch of chapters, and so he sent me this bunch of chapters at the beginning. And I had to come downstairs to him and give him the bad news, which was either he could write a textbook on wood frame architecture, or he could write a story about a house made by framing. And so that was really the only hump that we had to get over. And that was done very quickly and fairly painlessly.
All my footnotes are gone.
So,
And one of the nice things about the computer is that instead of doing this on a printed page with a red pencil, the way you might have done back in college, the computer allows editing so that all my precious words got put over into the right-hand column if she wanted to move them around or get rid of them. And I didn't really even notice. I got to look at it as kind of a new document. So I have to say, word processing makes it really great for a couple who've been married for 39 years not to get into fisticuffs about changes in the chapters.
Also, the stuff is over there on the side, and if something really needs to come back, it can come back. Which is great. It was amazing.
Let's just jump into another chapter.
Let's do.
Okay.
Okay. Page 27, is that what we're doing?
We're going to page 27. That last chapter took place in April of 1879. This chapter is also April 1879, just a couple of weeks later. It's called Italians in Kansas. What is Italianate style, Mrs. Peale? We asked one night as the spring rain pattered ceaselessly on our roof. Does it not refer to a foreign land?
Yes, it does. It refers to a faraway, very old country on the continent of Europe called Italy.
We've been thinking that common sense would indicate that we were built in the Kansas style, would it not?
Kansas style?
Yeah, sorry, she erupted rather unpleasantly.
We
were rather taken by surprise. Sorry, my line.
From what I have heard from the people around this dining table, I would say that any house unfortunate enough to be made in the Kansas style would be made entirely of sod and mud.
Good heavens, or roots.
With a few cottonwood logs to hold up the door and one window, if that. Sod and mud.
No, you cannot mean.
I most certainly do. You, Ambleside, instead of all your fine timber and strong, beautifully crafted joinery, could have been made out of
What? Sod? And she enjoyed herself, rather at our expense, for a good while. At least it interrupted the tedious rain. We pressed on through her burbling. Are we neither in any American style, then, Mrs. Peale?
Ah, an astute question, Master House. I would say there is an American style, Ambleside, but apparently you are no example. Back in my time, and in the time of my parents, we built houses that were simple, practical, and sound. Oh yes, occasionally you would see some poor building where the proud new owners had stuck Greek pilasters on either side of their front door, or some such fluty nonsense, to announce both their wealth and their lack of taste. But that really was the limit in my time of architectural vanity.
Vanity? We did not know that word.
From the Latin, vanus, empty, void, idle, or fruitless.
She paused. We might have appreciated a snippet of reassurance, but she continued her lesson, and we hastened to keep up.
Now I hear much talk of fashion, and the fashion seems to be to imitate Europe of all things.
Please instruct us then what Italianate means, we pressed.
According to Mrs. Hart, it is a style very much in fashion. She loves to talk about your large lintels, your fanciful corbels, your many different paint colors, your broad or hanging cornice. So you have cornices, Ambleside. Sounds rather like an affliction. Do you suffer from cornices, sir?
Now you are making merry with us, we protested over the resounding guffaws and cackles. We would say that we are rich in elaborate woodwork and pleasant carving.
Are you?
Well, we are. Much more so than the several houses recently built within our long view toward the village. And while their roofs are steeply pitched, we know that our roof is flat.
Flat? You are flat-roofed? I'm not sure I've ever seen such a thing except perhaps on a chicken coop. Oh, terrible Hermione.
Raising our voice, we soldiered on. Our corbels and cornice are painted in 4 different colors.
4? Like a harlequin?
A muffled rumble. Surely, we insisted, such embellishments prevail in the fashionable country of Italy. They must, if we are Italianate. We had managed to score a point. She quieted.
You are brand new and the height of fashion, Ambleside. That is clear. And it is I who am old and out of date. The Hart's guests speak of so many different house styles now. I hear them talk of Queen somebody, Gothic something or other, someone's revival, Second Empire, never first or third, and even, God help us, Egyptian. But they seem to disdain anything that sounds the least bit familiar to me. It is quite dislocating. Dislocare.
Latin.
To put out of place.
And after the briefest pause,
That is most certainly an apt description of me.
we thought about this and forgave her at our expense. After all, we were born here, and she, indeed, was not. The rain had finally stopped, and the still prairie offered a welcome nocturnal silence. Do you suppose, Mrs. Peale, that Newton, Kansas resembles the countryside of Italy any more than it does that of Ambleside, England?
It does not seem likely to me from the few paintings I have seen.
Came her gentle reply. She fell silent, and we peered out into our landscape, wondering about the poor, one-eyed Kansas-style houses that might be beyond our view. Presently,
Italy is the land where the Latin language started. You may be interested to know.
we most certainly are.
A language for which I have great affection. My interest in it originally derived from my father's love of Ovid. Though I would have enjoyed Latin more, it must be said, had I not been obliged to teach it. Well, I'm sure that's true of many things.
Was this before you were married, Mrs. Peale?
No. Years after.
We treaded as lightly as a cat. Pray, where did you teach?
I was an instructor at the Hartford Female Seminary. That august institution was founded by a one-woman militia named Catherine Beecher. It was only the second college in the country where a woman might get an advanced education. I entered as a student in 1825, 2 years after Simon passed. Passed away. Died, Ambleside.
You didn't say. Oh, how very sad. But Mrs. Peale, if you married in 1819, that means you were wed for...
3 years, 4 months, and 2 days. A bride at 17, a widow at 20.
That seems quite brief.
Such a loss as no one can fathom.
She fell silent again. We apologize deeply, Mrs. Peale, if we have caused you pain.
You are blameless, Ambleside, blameless. But enough. Good night.
Shall we talk a little about working during COVID, dear?
We could do that. The wonderful thing for us about COVID, we did have a wonderful pandemic, I'm sorry to say, was that our kids came and stayed with us for long periods of time to get out of the city. And so, as I'm sure you all know, all writers need first readers. Those are very important, but we were very lucky because we had first listeners, and that was extraordinary because the book is all dialogue. And so at night, when we had a new chapter that had been through both computers, we would sit and read the chapter to one son and his wife, or the other son and his girlfriend, and get a response and hear what it sounded like and get feedback. And that was really extraordinary. And we have COVID 100% to thank for that.
And the other thing we have, I mean, we're grateful that we have this time to work together, essentially side by side, and discuss chapters, discuss plot. I knew from the first page and how this book ended, but I did not know that much about what was in the middle. And so we spent a lot of time discussing plot during the middle of the day, not at the end of the day after you've been to work and you're home and you're tired, but when we were buzzing around and fresh and had just finished pulling a lot of weeds.
Yes, yes. I worked out my opera cancellation on the vegetation.
Oh.
Definitely.
So speaking of reading aloud, let's do another chapter. What do you want to add? Go ahead. Wait, are there any questions?
Ask it.
Yeah, it's a good time for questions.
Does anybody want to throw out a question?
Question. Did you spend time at Ambleside as a younger person visiting great-grandparents or grandparents or relatives
This is the paragraph about the family. You knew that.
No.
We first came to Newton in 2007 to visit Ambleside. My mother's mother grew up in that house. But when she was 19, she eloped with the mailman and moved to Santa Barbara. Now, I've been to Kansas and I've been to Santa Barbara, and I think they're both fabulous places, but my grandmother was not particularly happy here, and she never really came back. So my mother never saw this house, but she spoke about it and she knew of it because it was essentially where my grandmother grew up. And in fact, my mother's mother-in-law, the resident, Emmeline Hart of the house, would come to Santa Barbara and spend all summer living with them in there. So we wrote first, God bless the Harvey County Historical Society is what I have to say, because it all started with the Harvey County Historical Society. I wrote them a letter and said, my ancestor built a house called Ambleside. Have you ever heard of it? Well, we got the letter right back that said, yes, in fact, the house still exists. It is at number 1 Ambleside Lane, and go check it out. So we wrote a letter to.
You did a reverse lookup.
I did a reverse lookup. In those days, you could do that. Maybe you probably still do that. Anyway, in those days, it was easy because you could go to the library and you could get a reverse lookup book, and you simply looked up the address and you found the names of the occupants. And so I found that, and we wrote them a letter saying we were going to be in Kansas City because Susan's family lives in Kansas City. We're there 2 or 3 times a year, so we were going to be. We said in June we're going to be June 7th. We're going to be out. This was to people we didn't know. On June 7th, we're going to be in Newton, and my ancestors built Ambleside. And just so you know, if you see people out on your sidewalk taking photographs of your house, that's who it is. We got a letter back 2 weeks later. The giveaway that these people were fond of the house was that the stationery, the envelope that the letter came in, had a lined, engraved drawing of Ambleside on it. And in the letter, they were very gracious, and they invited us for lunch, and we have had a correspondence ever since, and we had a lovely lunch with them and a wonderful tour of the house. They have been preserving the house since 1994 when they bought it. And they bought it, as Phil Anderson told us today, and I don't have that note with me, from a woman named Laura. Janet Lance, who lived there for 8 years before that. Anyway, so that's how we first came to know the house.
When we met these people, well, to back up a little bit, because Warren's mother had never been here and she had no relationship with the house, we didn't really know very much about the family, the Hart family. So we arrive at the house and we find that, first of all, the Hardy County Historical Society has boxes and boxes about the Hart family and
The Nicholsons.
and the Nicholson family, who the youngest Hart daughter married. And so we began to find out things about Warren's family. And also the current owners of the house had done wonderful research and had a phenomenal photographic collection of the house over not just decades, but really 100 years, including that picture.
And which also, then we went back to the Hardy County Historical Society and found the records of, particularly the Civil War records of Henry Luke Hart. And that also plays into the book. Anyway, so it's sort of a trove of material. This is our historical novel. We tried to hew as closely as possible to the facts. And
Well, we hewed to the facts as they pertain to the house. We made up a lot, almost everything having to do with the people. We took our cues from things like Henry Luke Hart's Civil War papers and his mustering out stuff and things like that. But the character of all the characters is fiction.
should we read some fiction?
I guess we should read some fiction.
And then we'll ask, and then there'll be more time for questions. This is going to be Sabine Woman. This chapter is called The Sabine Woman. It's on page 55. And we're just going to read a part of the chapter. This takes place in March of 1884, thus 5 years after the last chapter that we just read. Mrs. Peale called to us one day in late winter.
Ambleside does that every time. The sun is peering through my dining room window today and falling no farther than the feet of the sideboard. Soon it will be rising higher in the sky and it will no longer shine in directly. I shall miss it. But it means that winter is ending and our growing family will welcome the spring.
We were glad to hear from our portrait, for we had been wondering about something and welcomed an opportunity to seek her wisdom. We responded, "We were reminded of the day that you found yourself in our parlor and then our upstairs bedroom. You told us how the sun blazed in through our tall windows so remarkably. That was the day the wallpaper was hung, Mrs. Peale. Remember you that day?"
Do you mean?
She replied hotly.
Do I remember the day I was thrown to the ground and carried off by a big hairy brute like one of the Sabine women? I'm not likely to forget it.
We decided to delay our curiosity about a Sabine woman and proceeded to our current concern. We believe that it was on that day that you first mentioned a Hebrew, Mr. Boaz. It did not seem the moment to inquire.
I was rather in extremis, yes.
Since that time, we have been concerned, in the reference you made during that extremis, that we do not know what a Hebrew is. Is that a word for a purveyor of wallpaper? We sensed a slight pause before she answered.
Ambleside, you are by far the most tenacious student I ever had. You listen.
We have always listened, Mrs. Peale, but before we knew you, we could not understand. Now, we find we want to understand everything.
Everything? Well, I can only tell you the things I know myself, which in the great scheme of things is very little. But I can address your question today. What a Hebrew is. Whew, there are many answers to that question, Ambleside. Many answers. In fact, it is a question that goes to the roots of Western civilization.
We were surprised. You mean that wallpaper is that important to the history of man? This took us quite by surprise.
You are a most amusing domicile. No. Now see here, let us get one thing straight. Mr. Boaz is a Hebrew. True. Mr. Boaz sells wallpaper. True. But it does not therefore follow that all Hebrews sell wallpaper. Do you understand? That is called false logic.
But what, then, does it mean?
The word itself has a number of meanings. It can refer to a language, a race of people, or a member of an ancient religion.
Religion?
Oh dear. From the Latin, religare, to bind, to place an obligation on. That is, to hold fast to a god, gods, or a set of beliefs.
We were compelled to interrupt. Do you mean to tell us, Mrs. Peale, that religion is similar to language among men? That there is more than one? And that people can be one religion and not understand people who are of another?
You know,
She said after a moment.
you have a way of parsing things, Ambleside, that cuts quite neatly to the chase.
We did not understand these words, but her tone was reassuring and we did not interrupt.
I, for example, am what is called a Christian. I hold fast to the teachings of a religious leader called Jesus, who was himself a Hebrew, as in a member of that very old religion.
Oh, so that means that you studied in school conducted by this Mr. Jesus? This prompted a very evident sighing sound, followed by...
This Mr. Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago.
Oh, when Latin and Greek were spoken, and Ovid wrote stories. We were very anxious that she know that we are not as dumb as a door.
Yes, in fact, at that very time and in that very part of the world. Now then,
She continued.
to begin again, many people followed the new teachings of Jesus, but some held fast to their old beliefs. We call those people Hebrews, or sometimes Jews, though in my day that word was usually only used when preceded by rude adjectives. It is a fact that many Christians loathe the Hebrews, though we Sutters were not among them. Mr. Boaz, for your information, owns a store in Newton that sells a great abundance of useful things, from fabrics and sewing notions, sheets and blankets and rugs, to soap and knickers and corsets, stockings and garters and shoes, hairbrushes and combs, kitchen pots and pans, to furniture, chandeliers,
And wallpaper?
and yes, wallpaper. Mr. Hart is very fond of Mr. Boaz. Mrs. Hart is not.
Why is that? We asked. Mrs. Peale paused, and after a moment we said, do you mean she dislikes this merchant because of his religion? Then we'll stop there. Are there any questions come up tomorrow?
I'm going to pose a question and answer it.
Oh, great.
By telling you the answer, you can find out tomorrow, actually. But the question is, people do ask us, as you've been listening to these chapters, where's the conflict? And the conflict is in the carpentry. And I will leave you with that. If you want to know more about that, Warren has condensed his 8-hour lecture into 30 minutes.
Well, 45.
I don't know if you have 45, you have to ask the boss over there. But it has to do with the fact that Mrs. Peale's husband, Mr. Simon Peale, was a carpenter in the early 1800s in the East, and he built houses the way they had always been built, out of wood in this country. And suddenly she learns the truth. We'll do that tomorrow.
Great. Okay. We are,
Do you want to say any more about Mrs. Peale's background? You said that she was widowed very young and that she is teaching. And-
Yes,
And so she's been dead for a long time.
Mrs.
It's
Peale-
almost 130 years.
yes. Mrs. Peale died, she was just about 40 years old. She died in 1841. And so,
Mrs. Peale is fictional, by the way.
and so she now comes back to life, for the lack of a better word, in 1879. But so her life was the first half of the 1800s. And then everything from 1841 to 1879, she did not know about. So that also happens in the book. She finds out by listening at the dinner table a great deal of what has happened and is, has reactions to that. And she tells much of that to Ambleside as she learns it.
And she
She-
took very seriously her life as a Latin teacher.
Yes, in order to earn her keep, she went to work for Catherine Beecher, who was a real person, and she really did found the female seminary in Hartford, which was the center of learning and sort of progressive culture.
She is Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister,
That's what I'm saying.
the
Yes,
very same.
and
She lived next door to Mark Twain. And so Beecher started the female seminary, which was not called a college, but essentially it was the second institution of higher learning for women in this country in 1825.
so we have Mrs. Peale going back to school by her parents, and then she becomes, at Miss Beecher's invitation, she becomes the instructor of Latin and Greek in the school, and she teaches there for quite a while until she dies.
And that's a whole other chapter that we're not going to read.
Not by the
How
way.
she died.
Or a
Anyway,
teaser.
We're gonna jump ahead quite a few years. We are in a chapter on page 91. This is called Joe March's Children, and it takes place in May of 1893.
By this time, there are 3 daughters in the house. Jessie, the oldest, Edith, the
My
middle
grandmother.
child, and Lottie, who is much younger, but coming along.
A large box turtle was making its way across the yard towards Sand Creek, which was presently swollen with spring rain. We have watched this fellow cross back and forth for some years. Sometimes his progress was interrupted by the girls, who would scoop him up like an old friend and carry him off, but he always found his way back. The girls were getting older now, and his trips were less often interrupted. Their attention seems to lie elsewhere. For us, his slow, determined march to the water has always been a pleasant afternoon's diversion. Just as our hard-shelled friend reached the riverbank, Mrs. Peale addressed us.
Oh, Ambleside, are you there?
No, we replied, hoping this might amuse her.
Ah, where have you gone?
We have developed 4 feet beneath us, Mrs. Peale, and we are making our way to Sand Creek.
Well, you may want to turn around and go into town when I tell you what has happened there.
We shall turn around this instant and go into town. We answered, won't they be surprised to see us on Main Street?
Civilization! Civilization is what is happening on Main Street. It has finally reached our frontier village on the edge of the known world.
Pardon us, Mrs. Peale, But we have always been given to think that an Italianate mansion is the very embodiment of.
Oh, you vain old house. There's a bookstore, Ambleside. A bookstore has opened in Newton. Think of it. To see what has been written since I was dead. How unusual that would be. People have always wondered how future generations would look back and judge their own time. Oh, if I could get my hands on those books. We just went and visited that bookstore today.
Yes.
That's like lessons.
Very good. Okay. Questions that we are done reading, but feel free to ask anything that might come up. Question.
Can you tell us about the house now?
The house indeed is been occupied. It was indeed vacant for some time. It was in and it was then bought by this woman whose name you want to remind me is
Janet Lance.
Janet
That's-
Lance.
Phil Anderson told us that.
Phil Anderson told us that. And she lived there until 1994. She lived there for 8 years. And then the current owners bought it, and they have been restoring it just really lovingly. Both the exterior, but the interior as well. They really wanted to bring the interior back, very much like the rooms that you're in. They wanted to bring it back to the Victorian period, and they spent the the weekends going to garage sales and to antique stores and trying to get things that would work. There's a chapter in here called Tussy Mussies, which is a thing that one puts on one's marble top table, and which is for instance of things that they would like to acquire for the house. So it's well loved and well looked after now, which is great.
We completely invented in the book, the current owners of the house in the book are a complete invention.
They are
Let's
fictional.
make
Their
that.
name is fictionalized, and then they are fictionalized.
And we had fun with them.
But they were fabulous resources of background, because they know so much. They know when electricity was brought to the house. They know when plumbing was brought to the house. They know when the line of the trees, most of which are now gone, were planted in front of the house.
When there was a fire.
And when there was a fire in 1938, that is directly related to the balloon framing, which we'll discuss tomorrow.
Unless
Do
you're
they live there
desperate.
now?
Hmm?
Do they live in the house?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
Currently, yes.
yes,
Mhm.
yeah. The current owners.
The current owners
Yes,
of the house.
they were called away, or they would have been here, but they had to go out of town. Sadly.
Yeah.
We were to have another lunch at their house, but they had to go out of town.
Very sad.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes?
I loved your story at the beginning about being at the January or the New Year's Eve party and seeing a picture on the wall. Did you say that you were sitting there looking at the picture, imagining that person coming to life, and that's how this story?
No, it was really that the hostess turned to the painting, the portrait, which happened to be an early American portrait, as is Mrs. Peale. She turned to the painting because the hostess had clearly told this story before in this dining room to other people. You know how people do when they have their renovation stories. Many of us have renovation stories, our aggravations or whatever. And she clearly told the story before, and that's why she turned to the painting and said, "But you know all this already, don't you?"
So Mrs. Peale, who is addressed as Mrs. Spiel by everybody in the book, except Ambleside, is regularly addressed by people in the family
In certain,
in certain situations, but she's very much a presence in the dining room.
I love the imaginative picture. I had a very imaginative mother, and I can just imagine her. She told me stories about my dolls and their K-pop hearts that had me in tears if I left them undressed. So
Great. Excellent.
So what years did your family live in the house?
The question was, what year did the family live in the house? And so the Harts lived there from 1879 up through 1947. Emmeline died in 1947. And then the house transferred into other hands. So, but it was full 3 generations, and she, yeah.
And we, in the book, we stay with the 3 generations, and then other stuff happens.
One of the things that interests me is when you were explaining the historic fact of the painter. Even though the painting is fiction, but the painter, the artist, is not. And folks might be interested in
This book is, to some extent, this book is about the soul of art, and I brought in the portrait painter of Mrs. Peale. Is a real person who was an itinerant painter in New England and went from farm to farm, essentially, and was engaged to paint portraits of often the farmer's wife and or his children or both. He was a painter of extraordinary skill whose name is M.I. Phillips, and I'm debating about how much to give away here. Anyway, he's a painter of great skill, and
We have him being the painter who paints Mrs. Peale's portrait, commissioned by her father. So there is a relationship.
and if you go on we do have a website. Of course, everyone has to have a website. WeTheHouseBook.com. There are a series, not only are there many photographs of the Hart and the house then and now, but there's an image of a M.I. Phillips painting that we feel is very close to what the painting of Mrs. Peale would look like. And
if you just Google M.I. Phillips, you'll see marvelous collection.
And the reason I'm loath to give away too much more is because the latter part of the book is about Mr. Phillips and Mrs. Peale.
Yes.
And what you didn't say is about how he was lost to history.
Yes. So this is a particular.
You listen.
next.
M.I. Phillips was in fact became, I don't even know how you say it, became lost is the word. He's unknown for 100 years. His name was lost. His name as the author of some 70 paintings was lost. As happens sometimes in our history, but the extraordinary thing is a woman in 1976 did extensive research and scholarship because she looked at a series and she'd been looking at all these paintings that were clearly by the same individual. And she's saying, that individual is given by art historians, is given a couple of different names. One is called the Border or Limner, the other is the Limner of Kent. And she said, these are all by the same person, and we have to find out who that person is. And in 3 cases, he had, in fact, signed his painting. None of the other portraits were signed, but 3 of them were. She did her research, doing chemical analysis on the paintings, and determined that this group was all the work of one individual. And now the works of that individual, now known as M.I. Phillips, are very, very sought after. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in our little hometown just acquired one about 5 years ago, an absolutely stunning example of his work, and they now sell for millions of dollars. So it plays into the book. Thank you, Gretchen. Any other questions, thoughts? You want to test us on our Newton history?
Not a test, but did I understand you to say 2007 is the first time you saw the house?
That's correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you learned a lot of Newton history to put into the book then. That's quite amazing.
What was coincidental about my seeing that house in 2007 is that I teach design, and I teach the history of, I have a course on the history of wood framing, as Susan mentioned. Ambleside became this, as soon as I saw that house, Ambleside became the centerpiece of that lecture. And the lecture asks two questions. Why did someone build a house out of wood in a place that is hundreds of miles from the nearest tree that will give decent, cuttable, planeable timber? Because cottonwoods are not structurally sound. That's question one. Question two is, why did my great-grandfather build a house in the Italian style in the middle of Kansas? And so I spend the next 8 hours explaining it. And you'll get the condensed version.
Right.
May I ask where you were both born and how you met?
I'm from Kansas City, I admit it. I grew up in Kansas City.
Missouri?
We met in Missouri, but only by, a couple of football fields. At the end of my street is the state line.
And I was born in California, raised in New York. We met when I called up her roommate, and because I was running a small cabinet making business, and I called her roommate, who was a classmate of mine, and she had moved to New York, and I'd seen this one at parties and whatnot, but we had cared nothing for each other. And I called the roommate and to ask if she had anyone I could hire as a cabinet maker's assistant.
And this is the point in the story where he says to our children, this is the value of a landline.
Because the roommate wasn't home, so my friend was not home, so her roommate answers the phone. This person who I had no particular truck with, and I was sort of really desperate. And I said, listen, I'm really looking for somebody. Can you have Laura call me back if she knows anybody who'd be willing to be a cabinet maker's assistant? And Susan, after a pause, said, I'll do it. This was not the
There was
answer.
a long pause. And he says, I need somebody who can handle power tools. And
Susan said, that's no problem. I've been building sets for the last 2 summers. I can handle a skill saw, no
I
problem.
can do that. I was a playwright at the time, and I was supporting myself by house cleaning and babysitting. This sounded like a step up. So I went to work for him. That's what happened.
And I have to say now, even now, when we work together on building projects, it's excellent chemistry.
Yeah, it is true that prior to this, we did lots of working together. The
Yes.
only place that he barks at me is in the kitchen. He is an amazing cook, and our kitchen is very small. So.
When she asks what's for dinner, I say that's information is on a need-to-know basis.
That's true. The pandemic went on so long that Lauren started a new book. With the opening up of life, the actual writing of the book, it looks a little farther away because we're both now very busy with real life. But we do have another book in the works, and architecture does figure in that book, and history does figure in that book.
It takes place in Chicago, not Newton.
Just a short train ride.
How did you end up with Blue Cedar Press?
Great question. How did we end up with Blue Cedar Press is the question. We had cast around for various agents in New York. We're from New York. And inevitably the agents said, well, what is this book like? What other book is this like?
What other 5 books? That's what
True.
the thing, you have to fill out a form most of the time and name 5 books that are like your book. And we were stumped.
Yeah.
We
couldn't figure that out.
We
So-
couldn't figure it out, and
We collected a few rejection letters, and I always felt that this would be really well received if it was published by a regional press. And we explored a number of regional presses in centered, we drew the circle around Newton, and Blue Cedar Press had a really wonderful website and a really wonderful collection of titles. So we sent them a pitch and got a letter back. They said, that most publishers say send 2 chapters, send 3 chapters, and they did. And they wrote back, Gretchen wrote back and said, send the whole thing. So we did. And that's how we got there.
and
we're
we
very
are
happy.
grateful.
Yeah,
And that was last June.
that was last
That
year.
was last June.
It was a very fun editing process for first-time novelists. We found the process of working together so closely with them editing. I don't think you get the kind of editing care at a big publishing house that we got with Blue Cedar Press, because the close reading was very illuminating and useful and
Well, also,
fun.
Gretchen's background is American Studies and American History, and so she was just incredibly valuable in pointing out things that we needed to think about or clarify. Amazing. Research-wise, that was so much fun. We had 200 years that we had.
People.
Isn't that cool? We think it's really cool.
We happened to have just taken a photograph.
Yes.
So their 160-acre parcel goes Sand Creek, it goes along Sand Creek and then way back. And so it was at some point developed, in fact, by the family. So we have Emmeline Lane and Hart Lane, maybe it's Lane. Anyway,
Hart Drive.
Hart
Hart
Drive, very good, thank you.
So 160, was that a homestead?
Yeah.
Then?
It was, and.
He was the second owner.
Yeah.
After the initial land grant,
He wanted it.
and
It doesn't say it, we haven't talked about it, but Henry Hart, just quickly, we should probably wrap. Henry Hart was the iceman in town here, and he came here with his ice tools from Illinois after having been grievously wounded in the Civil War. When he finally got on his feet, he came along to find a town with no iceman. Found this town and purchased for $500. We have the abstract. In 1875, he bought 160 acres, but he had to have property that had a stream in it, and so he did. The part of Sand Creek that was part of that property is not that much, but it was enough to harvest ice. So, what a great job. If you have to work in Kansas over the summer, outside, what a great job is to be the Iceman. All summer long, you get to go in that house and bring out the blocks, and then they're all behind you as you're delivering. Oh, you'd be cool all day long. Smart man.
Good imagination.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
coming.
everybody.
Thank you.